Hello and welcome to Red Lens Podcast. Our guest today on Red Lens is another person I've known for a while, like my recent guests, Pat Graham on episode 13 and Scott Crawford on episode 15. Like both of them, today's guest and I also met in the late 1980s when we were teenagers in the DC punk scene. We both published punk fanzines at the time, and we bonded on being young zinesters in that scene. I'm really excited to have her here today to take us on a journey back to that time and then go through what she's been up to since then, including recent work to document that scene from decades ago. Welcome to Red Lens Podcast, Shawna Kenney.
Thank you, Brad. It's so good to see you again. Nomadic Underground.
No scene zine. All right. You may be more well known now for your creative writing, your journalism, and writing coaching, things you've been doing in more recent decades. And I'm excited to talk about that in a bit too. But why don't we start back before all that, going back to the 1980s in the DC punk scene? Tell me your story of how you got to that point in your life that led you to the punk scene in DC in the 80s. What brought you to DC, to punk rock, and to the slice of the hardcore scene that you helped foster in DC?
Yeah, well, I was a little bit on the periphery because as a teenager, was growing up in Southern Maryland, which a lot of people don't know what I mean by that or where that is. It's not the Eastern Shore. It's the very end of the other side of Maryland, St. Mary's County, and it's about an hour and a half of a drive from Washington, D.C., and about an hour and 10 from Baltimore. So it's a really rural area. It's a lot of Amish people, farms, and Navy bases. So there wasn't a lot of punk rock action going on down there, but there were kids interested in punk rock and getting cassette tapes and making each other mixtapes. And I met up with some of these kids in eighth grade and really started getting into punk rock by the beginning of high school, ninth grade, and sort of figured out that there was this thriving punk scene a drive away, not too far away, up in DC and Baltimore. There were these scenes going on. We kind of made our own fun being in a small town. There were other punks and freaks and goths and metalheads, and we'd put on our own ramp jams, and there were a few bands that we'd put on our own shows. And I dabbled in playing music. I played bass in a couple of bad bands at first before becoming a zinester, but that wasn't really my calling, even though I had played trumpet in grammar school for like 7 years. I
Oh,
wasn't the
awesome.
greatest bass player. By the time I got to high school, I was going to shows up in DC and Baltimore, and then I saw a lot of the periodicals coming out at the time and discovered the world of zines, and that really just spoke to me. I'd always been a big reader and writer, and I thought this is a great way that I could work on something with my friends. It was a good community activity, I guess. And it also gave me an excuse to talk to bands and talk to artists that I was interested in. You know, being a shy person, that's not always easy. But if you have a zine, you can go up to people and ask them if they'll do an interview.
That all sounds very familiar. Exactly, kind of a lot of the same reasons that I did a zine. And also, I in high school lived about 45 minutes outside of Atlanta. So in our suburb, we had a mini scene, a few of us in our high school and some other high schools out in the burbs, but pretty much had to go to Atlanta for real quote unquote shows and stuff. But
Yeah.
yeah, that all.
Yeah. And actually, when I was 15, may have been 16, I saw an article, and or actually, my mom cut out an article from the Washington Post for me. It was an interview with Ian MacKaye, and he was talking about his new band, Embrace. So Minor Threat had broken up, and he had this band Embrace, and my mom knew that I'd been listening to Minor Threat on my record player in my room. So she cut this article out and was like, I think you like this guy and his music. And I read the article, and in it he said that he answered all of his fan mail. So I immediately wrote him a letter and asked him if he would do an interview with me for my zine. And to my surprise, he wrote me back and said yes, and then invited me to introduce myself next time I saw him at a show, which really just demonstrated the whole punk rock ethos to me. It just tickled me that you could interact with artists in that way. You couldn't do that at a big rock concert.
Yeah, exactly. In my high school, I mentioned there were a few punks and other assorted like people who didn't fit in, and some people tried to start bands. At my high school, two people that went to my high school were Rich and Chris Robinson, who had a band called Mr. Crow's Garden at the time, which later became the Black Crows. So there was a lot of music, there were things going on, but yeah, and at that time they were just people who, and I did an interview with them. I went to one of their practices and interviewed them, and foolishly lost the tape at some point. I wish I still had it because I recorded some
Oh,
of their practice too.
oh,
But
that's
yeah,
cool.
it was just so different than like Rush concerts I'd been to like in seventh grade, things like
Yeah.
that, where you're just totally the audience and no interaction at all.
Yeah.
So I'd like to talk specifically about your history documenting radical political and cultural movements, which, after all, is the focus of this podcast. You were an active participant in, and in addition to that, also a documenter of the hardcore punk scene between the late '80s and like early 2000s, I think. You put out a zine that we already mentioned, No Scene Zine, that documented that scene. You organized shows. You were taking photos of bands. In recent years, you published an oral history of that scene with, I sort of think of it as a photography book, I guess. It's not
Mhm.
exactly that. It's sort of
It's
like,
kind of a coffee table book. Yeah.
yeah. And you also put out a photo zine that of your photos documenting that movement from the late '80s to the early 2000s. So I want to talk about all those things, but why don't we
Yeah.
start with your zine? You talked a little bit about that you started a zine to, as a shy person, be able to go talk to bands and talk to people very similar to what I did. But tell us a little bit about No Scene Zine. What was in it, and why did you create it? Where did you get the idea?
Yeah. Well, I saw other zines in stores like Smash or in the back of Maximum Rock and Roll. And then I thought, well, it would be cool to share with the world what's going on here in Maryland and DC and Virginia. And so at first I was writing scene reports and sending them to Maximum Rock and Roll and letting
Oh
them know
yeah, I
what
did
was
some of
going
those
on.
too.
You remember those?
Yeah.
Um, and then in the zine, it just became this collaborative thing where my friends could publish their poetry. They wrote record reviews. I interviewed bands. We took photos of skateboarders at skate competitions. And then eventually my friend Pam and I, who did the zine later, I didn't start the zine with Pam. I started it with a couple of friends in high school. I didn't meet Pam until I got out of high school, but I
Okay.
started it with my friend Mike Eli and my friends Mary Alice Woodburn and Libby Randall. And so we all worked on it together. And yeah, it was just a place to show what we were doing and a
Mm.
place to interact and express ourselves. So that's what it was at first. And then later, when I met Pam, when I was 18, right out of high school, we started interviewing a lot of bands together. And then we started doing show reviews together called Pam and Shawna at the Shows, which was sort of a spoof of Roger and Ebert
Oh, I didn't remember that. That's cool.
reviewers.
Yeah, reviewing shows. I love it.
And just talking about all the minutia and weird stuff that would happen at the shows or backstage or in the alleys, and stuff that normal people wouldn't talk about.
Yeah, building on that, so you did a zine, scene reports, show reviews, interviews, poetry. I love it. But building on that, you mentioned, I think, that you started booking some shows, putting on
Mhm.
shows yourself, organizing shows yourself. And those were largely matinee hardcore shows at the Safari Club, a place in DC. And that really blew up into a huge scene for a number of years. When did you start doing that? And can you describe for people listening what that was like?
Yeah, I started that in 88. Pam and I became fast friends and roommates and started going to all these shows together and lived together in Fairfax, Virginia. And we I mean, we were going to shows every night of the week. We were working and she was going to school and she was 19, I was 18. And we would travel to CBGB's in New York and go to matinees there. And we really wanted something like that to be happening in DC. And we kind of missed the first wave of hardcore in DC. We're a
Yeah.
little bit younger than the original Discord crowd. So I think that there was something about the New York hardcore scene and what was going on there that we were really attracted to, as well as loving everything Discord was doing and Positive Force was doing at the time. I started going to shows around the what's called the Revolution Summer era, and I love all of those bands. So we were kind of on the lookout for a place to do shows, and we approached the 9:30 Club, and they were not interested in doing matinees at the time. They said that they couldn't sell alcohol during the day, so it just wouldn't be worth it to them. And we'd spoken to a couple other places that weren't interested. And then just by a fluke one night, I went to the Safari Club. I was dating a guy in a band who had a show there at night, and I went there with him and his band, and there was some kind of confusion, and the headlining band canceled, and then his band all kind of left. I thought that they had left to go get equipment, but I got left at the club. and I and this is, before cell phones. I'm calling, leaving messages on answering machines, wondering if someone's going to come back and get me. I live out in the suburbs of Virginia.
And
Pam's out
you're
for the
just
night.
stuck there.
Yeah, I'm just stuck there. And Safari Club was normally an Ethiopian restaurant and nightclub disco. And sometimes during the week they had metal bands or new wave bands or experimental bands play. So that's mostly what they were. Nobody in our scene had really heard much about the Safari Club. So I'm stranded there. I'm sitting at the bar drinking cokes all night until 3 in the morning when they close, talking to the bar owner and the bar manager, and hoping that someone will come back and get me. And I get to chatting with them, and I ask them what they do there on the weekends. And they tell me they have go-go shows on Friday and Saturday nights, but during the days, the club is available. So I asked
Yep.
them if they would consider having a punk show, an all ages punk show with no alcohol, and kind of pitched them my idea. And they said, pick a date. Let's see what you can do. And then the owner of the nightclub actually also owned a taxi cab company, so he ended up putting me in a cab and having them drive me home for free because
That's funny.
it became
I,
apparent no one was coming to get me.
I think I remember reading in your book that someone from the go-go band Pleasure worked there. Is that right? Or or
Yes,
from
yes.
yeah.
One of the women from Pleasure worked there, and her brother Madupe was a manager at the club as well. And the
Okay.
owner was this guy named Haile, who was from Eritrea, actually.
There's a pretty large Eritrean community here in Minneapolis, so yeah,
Okay.
it's cool. And
Yeah.
Ethiopian community as well, and obviously there's historical conflict there, but
Hmm.
yeah, a lot of Ethiopian restaurants and stuff here. While you were saying that, was just thinking about experiences I had in DC at the time, where one time I was on the last metro train, I believe after a show, and I fell asleep on the train and woke up at the last stop somewhere way out in Virginia
Uh-oh.
and had no way to call anyone, no way to get back. And yeah, that's just what happened. You were just sort of stuck.
Yeah, you're stranded.
And
But it ended up being a good thing. I was excited to tell Pam that I had a place that I think we could do shows. And our first show was pretty small. It was a local band called Images. Well, they were from Annapolis, and a small band from Southern Maryland that I knew called OSWD and the Plastic Toys. And I can't remember who the third band was, but there were like maybe 75 people. And we were like, okay, well, that's not so
that's
bad on a
quite
Saturday
respectable. Yeah.
afternoon. Yeah. And so the club was happy with that. They were like making some money that they normally wouldn't have made on a Saturday afternoon. And then the second show we booked was Gorilla Biscuits headlining, coming from New York. And we had a mutual friend in common. My friend Toby, who I'd gone to high school with, had just moved to New York and was living with these guys. And so we booked Gorilla Biscuits with Swizz, local DC band,
Yeah.
and Outcrowd. And I believe the club owner threw an extra band on the bill without us knowing. He added Lucy Brown to the bill, and we were mad. We were like, no, we didn't want them to play, but whatever. You're going to pay them. We're not going to pay them. Um, but anyway, the second show was Gorilla Biscuits, and when we pulled up to the club for sound check 2 hours before the show, there was a line around the block, and we couldn't believe it. Like, where did these people come from? I mean, we had made flyers and put them in all the record stores and skate shops and put the
Yeah.
word out, but yeah, people were excited. It was Gorilla Biscuits' first show in the DC area. They were a new band. I think they just had a demo out at the time.
Hmm.
So yeah, it shocked the hell out of us. And that kind of just set the tone for the next 2 years, trying to live up to that.
That's amazing. It's one thing that I've noted today in like I go to some hardcore shows in the Twin Cities and do photography, and a lot of the young folks in the scene just like revere Gorilla Biscuits. It's like
Oh, really?
they just love Gorilla Biscuits. Yeah.
Um,
There was a Halloween show last year, the year before, where four local bands dressed up as other bands and played a set of this other band's songs, and one of the bands did a set of Gorilla Biscuit songs, and people just went crazy.
oh my gosh, how cute. Well,
Yeah,
yeah, they're a fun band and they're still a fun band and they remain friends to this day. So that's part of what was so great about these couple of years that we did those shows. We met so many people we otherwise would never have met in the crowd and on the stage. And that was what it was all about for me. It was just fun.
for sure. One thing I'm curious about when you started organizing those shows at the Safari Club, as you mentioned, you focused a lot on the emerging and growing New York hardcore scene, which maybe not all of the bands there were straight edge, but
Hmm.
of not drinking or doing drugs, but it was a big thing happening there at the time with bands like Youth of Today and others.
Yeah.
And at the same time, the DC scene had really spawned that idea of straight edge, right? But by that time in the late '80s, a lot of those folks from the Discord scene were pretty much disavowing straight edge as like a
Hmm.
movement or something to, organize your band or your scene around.
Yeah.
And there were some anecdotes about that. I was looking back at Live at the Safari Club, your book, where, people like Mark Anderson and Jason Farrell and others talking about some of that tension, or I don't know if tension's the right word, but just that difference. Um,
Hmm.
and a lot of the first wave of like, and people around the Discord scene were just sort of unaware entirely of this whole huge emerging scene right under their feet with
Yeah.
this idea that they had helped birth. And yeah, I'm just curious how, like, were you straight edge? Was that sort of what drove you
Yeah.
towards
Yeah, I
interest in that?
was.
Mhm.
And I loved that sound, the stuff that was coming out of New York, but I also loved all of the Revolution summer bands. And Pam came from the Midwest. She came from St. Louis, Missouri, and she had her own taste. She had had a punk rock radio show in college, and so we just really like to mix it up. And not everyone always appreciated that, but I booked Murphy's Law with Crucial Youth, and I booked Ignition with um I can't remember the bands from a couple of like more experimental bands from Philly, and we booked some of the local bands with the New York hardcore bands or New Jersey bands or California bands even. And to me, it was all punk rock. It was all under in the same stew.
Mhm.
Maybe other people saw a hard line of separation there, but to us, it was all good. It was all fun to just kind of mix up.
I love that. So I'd like to maybe shift focus a little bit from music to talk more explicitly about politics a little bit.
Mhm.
Your website describes you as being raised in the Washington, D.C. area on a steady diet of Fugazi. I've always been a radical girl with the RRR in a capitalist world, digging for story. Tell me yours. So, just from that sentence, a couple sentences, clearly you don't shy away from the political aspect of, what was the punk scene, embracing radicalism, talking about capitalism, and with a little tip of the hat to Riot Girl.
Mhm.
Did you think of what you were doing in the hardcore scene back then as political? Like you were just saying you were about having fun, but obviously politics were all infused throughout a
It was
lot of
all
this.
around
Like,
us. And especially being in DC, it was an especially political punk scene, which I didn't know because I had nothing to really compare it to yet.
yeah.
But the first shows I went to were at DC Space, and it was Jenny Toomey organized a benefit for people in Nicaragua. This is during the time of the Iran Contra scandal, and it must have been 84 or 85, just when Soulside changed their name from Lunch Meat to Soulside. Like those were
Hmm.
my first shows. The Amnesty International putting on benefits in the park with Positive Force, or big shows around the Washington Monument with PETA. Um, so I thought that all punk shows were like that all over the world. To me, that was like, the punk rock was a philosophy. It wasn't just a fashion or the Sex Pistols and stuff like that, you know? But that's just the scene that I happened to grow up in. And then when I moved to New York briefly and then to later to Los Angeles, I realized that not all scenes were like that. Not that there weren't political punk bands in those places.
Yeah.
That wasn't the dominating feeling, you know? That wasn't the dominating attitude in those scenes. Whereas like we're in Washington D.C., the belly of the beast, the center of power of the free world, the so-called free world, and we're doing percussion protests. Like that's just what you do on the weekend. Or every show's $5. Every show's a benefit. Like not every town had Positive Force or Fugazi or Discord or people like that leading their scenes. So I feel very lucky now. But I no, I wasn't. I didn't think of what I was doing as political. But I, looking back now, I realized that that scene really helped inform my ethos and my way of being in the world going forward. It introduced me to vegetarianism, feminism, anti-racist action, just being kind, collaboration, living in community. It just taught me all of those things. The DIY thing.
Hmm. I'd like to focus in on class a little bit. I listened to a recent interview you did on the Creative Nonfiction podcast, where one thing you talked about there was your working class background, your mom being a secretary, your dad being a maintenance worker, and you being a first generation college student. I'm kind of
Mhm.
interested to hear your thoughts on class in relation to the punks and hardcore scene, because definitely in DC, but really I think in all the cities I've been to, there are a lot of people in the punk scene that come from more petty bourgeois or upper middle class backgrounds who went to expensive private colleges. And in DC in particular, there were even people of quite children of quite powerful people in the world as part of the scene, you
Oh
know?
yeah.
Yeah, like a lot of people in the scene could sort of fall back on or leverage their parents' resources to buy expensive equipment, you know, things like that. Just love to hear you talk about your thoughts about class and your consciousness about class in the punk scene at the time
Yeah.
and now.
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, early on, I wasn't so aware of it until I lived up in the DC area and struggled with making a living and struggled to get myself into college and noticed that, yeah, there are a lot of rich hardcore kids from the suburbs or who went to private schools and had a lot of advantages. And that became clearer as I got older. I didn't begrudge them for it because there are worse things that they could be doing with their time and money for sure. But I can't say that I wasn't a little envious at times too. You know, I didn't have that kind of help going to college. I did a lot of different kinds of jobs, crazy jobs. One that I wrote a book about, working as a dominatrix in DC. But you know, I was a waitress, I was a nanny, I was a hotline operator, I was a freelance writer. You know, I've worked just about every job you could do in the DC area to keep myself afloat and to get myself an education. So, yeah, that became more apparent. The class differences became more apparent when I was in college, for
Mm.
sure.
Yeah, I mentioned it. You mentioned your book. I assume referring to I Was a Teenage Dominatrix, which I haven't read. I need to read it.
Mhm.
My understanding of it is that by definition probably deals with class and gender and a lot of other dynamics. But I was trying to remember back, like in the early 90s when the Riot Girl phenomena started within the punk scene, and DC was one of the sort of the centers where that happened. And I just couldn't
Mhm.
remember, like, if the some of the more Riot Girl type bands were intersected with the Safari Club scene or if it was like totally separate or yeah, just curious
Yeah.
about your thoughts on Riot Girl at that time and now and
Yeah. So in 91, by 91, I had moved away to New York briefly, and then I came back and started college, and someone else started doing shows at Safari Club. There was another set of promoters. Unbeknownst to me, I didn't even know what was happening there. I was just really focused on school. I'd still go to shows every once in a while at the 9:30 Club. And then when I met my husband in 95, he told me that there were shows at the Safari Club and it was now called Chamber of Sound. And he introduced me to all the people who were going to shows there. And I went and he brought me back to a show there. I think Shelter was playing at the time. And I was so surprised to see that half the crowd was women. Everyone had a camera. People had merch tables set up, like distros were there selling things. And it just looked a lot different, but yet it had a lot of the same feel. So I kind of missed the whole Riot Girl thing because I was a little bit older. I had moved on from hardcore and like moved to New York and then got into college. And I think it was girls younger than me who were starting it around 91. So I was only vaguely aware of it. So I
Hmm.
don't necessarily identify with it, but I really admire it. I thought it was really cool once I did hear about it years later and heard the music years later and thought, wow, maybe I could have used something like that in the 80s. Pam and I were definitely in the minority. There weren't that many women in the hardcore scene. And I always wished that there were more, and there are more now. But yeah, I wasn't that aware of it at the time.
At the end of your photo zine that you put out, All Access Bands on Film, you included a what you called a womanifesto,
The
a
manifesto.
manifesto, which I found to be very powerful.
Mm.
Yeah, because like you said, you were a young woman in a largely male-dominated scene and industry and world for that matter, and that essay seems to really get at that reality that you were living. Can you tell us about what it's trying to express and what led you to
Yeah.
include it in the zine?
Yeah, I think as I was going out to more and more shows and taking photos beyond the punk scene, like at big festivals and big rock concerts and bigger clubs, I came to understand ho- really how special the punk scene is, and that I just bumped up against a lot of sexism. I would be backstage at a hip hop show and waiting for the artist to answer their door for an interview that I'd set up through their publicist, and then be met at the door by a naked person who, or a guy who just drops his towel and calls me a bitch. Or I'd be in the photo pit and have a band spit beer all over my camera. There were just like all kinds of situations like that where it just was so different than being in a little show at the Wilson Center packed up against all of your friends and no one who would harm you. So yeah, it was just uh, my Womanifesto is a personal essay just expressing all of my frustration with some of those years of being the only girl. And I also wrote for skate and music magazines, and often I was the only woman on the masthead, or I had to fight really hard to get my stories in certain places. And it still happens. Just a few years ago, I was writing a lot for a hip hop magazine website, and for Women's History Month, they asked me to cover some female rappers, and I'd done an interview with one, and somehow my byline ended up with someone else's name on it, a man's
What?
name, my editor's name on it. And he had changed the headline to focus on her rap group rather than on her. And just, a lot of things like that happen. And I was like, yeah, this is how women get silenced. This is how our voices get silenced.
Like quite literally.
Hmm. Or erased.
You mentioned some of the writing you've done since your early zine days with No Scene Zine. I'd love to just hear maybe a little bit of a timeline of your writing as that developed. So you started doing a zine, and yeah, how did that turn into a writing career?
Yeah, I didn't plan it. The scene was really just something I did for fun. And then when I went to college, I wrote for the school newspaper for fun. And I started interviewing bands who were coming through, hip hop groups and punk bands and rock bands, and just covering different issues that arose. And I had a lot of fun doing that. And I couldn't believe that they would actually pay me to do that. I mean, it was, $25 a story, but it was super exciting for me to be able
Good.
to get paid to go out and do what I loved doing anyway and talk to people and get to know them better and then shape a story around that and then to be paid for it. That just it blew my mind because I didn't know a single writer growing up. I didn't know you could do that. So I did it more and more. I did it all through college, and then I started pitching stories to bigger magazines and outlets. And this was the days of typing a pitch letter and sending it in the mail with a self-addressed stamped envelope and waiting for the
Just waiting.
acceptance or rejection, yeah, from the editor. But I started placing stories in magazines like Transworld and a music magazine called B-Side, and I guess it was just enough to give me encouragement to keep moving in that direction. It just felt good. It felt right. I still didn't really know how to make that into a job or a career, but I just kept doing it on the side. And when I moved to California, I moved there hoping that Transworld Skateboarding would hire me full time if I were in the area, and they didn't. but but I continued freelancing and writing for bigger and bigger outlets and working temp jobs, office jobs. Eventually landed a job as an editor at a fetish magazine, and the publishers of that magazine are actually who put out my first book. I was a teenage dominatrix. They encouraged me to write my memoir because it was just based on stories I was telling around the office
Hmm.
about this interesting job that I had while I lived in Washington, D.C. So they put that book out, and that introduced me to the whole literary community of Los Angeles. And I met a lot of like minded authors and did events with them, and it was like punk rock all over again. Like, let's put on our own readings, let's put on our own events, let's team up, who can headline, who can bring who on tour. And it was just a lot of fun. Like, I got to use all of my punk rock skills in the
Yeah.
literary world as well. And from there, my next book was a book called Imposters, and it's a coffee table book, and it was born out of a magazine article that I had done on the people who dress as characters and superheroes who stand on Hollywood Boulevard and pose for
Hmm.
photos with tourists for tips. I lived very close to Hollywood Boulevard, and I was obsessed with these people, and I did a magazine story on them. We only featured like five of them in the story, and I collaborated with a photographer who shot great photos of them in their homes getting ready for the day.
Oh, cool.
And the editor of the magazine liked the story so much, he was like, keep interviewing these people. I think I could get you a book deal. And so even though I had a literary agent, the editor of this magazine got me the deal with Mark Batty Publishers, and they put out a coffee table book of like 50 of these interviews. And then a couple years later, I edited an anthology called Book Lovers, which was published by Seal Press, a feminist press that was based in San Francisco area. And that was sort of a reaction to the 50 Shades of Grey phenomena.
Hmm.
An editor and I there were just like chatting it up, and we were just dismayed at the poor writing quality of the 50 Shades series. Like, I didn't begrudge the author her success at all, but I just wish that it was written better. So we put together this idea of literature inspired erotica. And so that's what Book Lovers was. And then a few years later, my husband and I were being interviewed on a radio show in DC with Dave Brown, a fellow Washingtonian, and someone suggested possibly doing a documentary on the Safari Club. And I was like, nah, it was so dark in there. All of the footage that I've seen is terrible. People were shooting with video at the time, and that stuff just doesn't hold up. And I was
Yeah.
like, I really don't think there's enough footage to make a documentary. But it's a nice thought, and I don't even know who would be interested. And then someone pointed us to Joe Wagandanda, whose photo is on his photo of the band Underdog from New York is on the cover. And I went to see him. He is a podiatrist living in the suburbs of Maryland, but he dug up all his old photos and showed them to us. And they were
Oh,
these
wow.
wonderful black and whites of 88 and 89 at the Safari Club. And I just cried looking at his photos. Like, they just were like a portal to the past. I'd never really seen many photos from that time period of my life. And
Mm.
just and seeing his in black and white like that, these crisp black and white prints, it was just, it gave me chills. And then the more we talked about it, the more we thought, well, maybe we could put the word out and see if anyone else has photos. And, I didn't really take any photos at that time. I didn't even own a camera yet. Uh, most of the photos that I shot in my zine, All Access, I shot on a borrowed camera from American
Mm.
University. I didn't own a camera until I graduated in 95. So the more we thought about it, the more we thought maybe it could be a collaborative thing and almost just like a yearbook for the people who enjoyed this place at this time, at this moment in time. And maybe 4 people in the world will be interested in it, but let's let's just put it together, because there are a lot of punk books out there. A lot of them say hardcore died in 85. And that kind of dismisses the whole next generation that came along. And I never thought that that was fair. And at this point, we were like, well, now we have enough of a history to document. So we put the word out, and the community really came through and seemed excited about it. And everyone contributed photos and flyers and their time for us to interview them. And we didn't want to, we probably could have crowdsourced it and done a GoFundMe, but I really didn't want to be a publisher. I like writing and editing, but I don't want to be a publisher. So I put
Hmm.
together a book proposal and shopped it around to a few independent publishers and landed at Rare Bird Books in Los Angeles. And he immediately got what we wanted to do. We wanted it to be the size of a record album. We wanted it to kind of sit next to Glenn Friedman's books on the shelves and be the same dimensions, not, it's probably not the same quality. Um, but, um, but yeah, we had very specific ideas of how we wanted it to be, and Rare Bird helped us make it a reality and do the distribution and handle all the things that we didn't want to handle. So now it's out there in the world, and it's really cool to hear from people that I haven't heard from in a long time and to meet new people through it. It's just, you never know when you create something where it's going to go or how it's going to touch people. And that book has been that kind of experience for us.
And I bet you sold more than 4 copies.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. Yeah, we did an event at the one of the libraries in DC, and there were 100 people there, and it was just, and got to hear so many moving stories and connect with people that I hadn't seen in such a long time, and meet new people who had stories that I'd never heard. So it's
That's
all
cool.
worth it.
So your book, I Was a Teenage Dominatrix, kind of documents your experiences. This book documents like a whole scene with a lot
Hmm.
of contributors, like you said, multiple photographers, clips of interviews with a bunch of different people about their experiences. So, yeah, that book was really a lot of the why I was interested to talk to you for this podcast as sort of a documentary project or an oral history project and a visual project about that scene. Why did you so yeah, why did you think it was important to document it?
Like I said, I had seen a lot of punk books that had documented the earlier years,
Hmm.
and I felt like that little wedge of time had been forgotten or hadn't been so well documented. And now we had enough time away from it. There was enough distance from that era that I thought that it warranted its own collection. And the way that I think of it, and I think I wrote this in the introduction, is there are a million books on punk rock out there. I try to collect them all. I love them.
Same.
And I really wanted us to just be a small piece of that conversation.
Mhm.
I just felt like there's a place for us on the shelf too, for people who participated in that scene at that time,
Mhm.
wherever they may be now.
Yeah. And more recently, as another addition, I suppose, to that conversation, you published a photo zine, which we've made reference to before, but let's talk about that a little more now. I sort of think of it as a small book, but I guess photo zine, small book, similar.
Mhm.
And that's all access bands on film. And so that is just your photos from that period. Tell us what's in it and why you published it. And since photography is my passion and a big focus of this podcast. I'd love to talk some about what you write in there about not feeling confident calling yourself a photographer, even though
Mhm.
you were taking photos at shows for many years. You were developing film and making prints in a dark room, and
Yeah.
um, that sounds
I
like a
guess I
photographer to
was,
me. But yeah, what's your
yeah.
relationship to photography? You said you didn't even own a camera; you were just using a borrowed camera for a lot of that
Mhm.
time. And
Yeah, so these are mostly photos from the 90s while I was a photography student.
okay,
And I was at American University and I was still going to a lot of shows. And like I said, I was going to bigger ones now. I'm going to Lollapalooza, I'm going to
hmm
shows in bigger venues, and I'm also learning how to use a camera for
hmm
school. So I checked the school camera out and sign up for time in the dark room and use their film and go shoot, who's ever on stage at the 9:30 Club or the Black Cat that weekend, whether it's like Luscious Jackson or Sick of It All, who I had known from the Safari Club days, so I would naturally just go to see them anyway, or Agnostic Front, uh,
hmm
Fugazi, and then I would go to festivals like Lollapalooza, and I shot L7 and Green Day. So I shot a bunch of these bands, really just practicing how to use a camera and learning photography. And a lot of times I couldn't afford to get all of the film developed. Film is very expensive, and you print the
yeah,
contact sheet and then you circle the print that you want to make, and then you try not to use too much paper. And so a lot of these rolls of film I had only printed one photo from or none. And they were
yep,
sitting in a box for years. I
same.
think I, yeah, I think I stopped shooting like in the early 2000s, when everybody started having a camera on their phone. But these rolls of film are sitting in a box, and during the pandemic, my husband took the film and took it to a place that digitized it. Like the technology had caught up now, and it became pretty easy to digitize negatives.
Yep,
And he got them all digitized for me, and it was so fun to pull them up on the computer and see what I actually had. Like I'd
yeah,
forgotten a lot of this stuff. So I thought that was really sweet and fun. And then I thought, well, I'm not going to just keep opening my computer to look look at these photos whenever I want. It would be cool if they were in some sort of format that I could hold in my hands. Maybe somebody else would want to see them too, because a lot of them never saw the light of day. Some of them were published in school newspapers or in music
hmm
magazines that no longer exist, but a lot of them just never went anywhere. So I was like, screw it. I'm a zinester. I can
put
make
out
a
a
zine.
zine.
This was a pandemic project.
Okay.
So I made a zine, put all of my favorite ones into this format, and had a friend help me find a printer, like an actual printer, so it wasn't print on demand, and hired somebody to help me lay it out because I know nothing about design. And made a limited edition zine. I made 100 to begin with, and they sold out. And then I did a second edition last year, and they're signed and numbered. So it was just kind of a fun little passion project that made me happy, which is what zines always were for me anyway. But it ends up being a kind of a fair documentation of music in the 90s too.
Yeah, I love it. And so you did it all DIY style. You just found a printer, printed them yourself. When I ordered mine through the mail, you wrapped it up and went to the post
Yeah.
office and sent it like back in the day.
Yeah, I know. I was like, it's funny. I'm in my 50s and I'm a zinester again.
You know,
But it felt really good. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about, trying to get a big publisher to put it out. It was just something that came from my heart and something that I wanted to share with people.
Mhm. I love that. Yeah, similar to you, I'm sitting on all these photos from when I would bring my camera to shows. I wish I brought it to every show. Now I'm kicking myself, why didn't I? But
Yeah.
part of the reason was I was young and shy and awkward and didn't want to draw attention to myself, but also I wanted pictures of bands for my zine, but also
Yeah.
I was like walking to shows at the 930 Club in DC Space in the 80s at a time when it was pretty sketchy and like with an expensive camera. I'm like,
Yeah.
maybe I don't want to bring it today, you know?
Murder capital of the world at the time.
Yeah, but I just wish I'd taken pictures at every show I was at.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm still similar to you, but a little earlier, about maybe 10 years ago now, I just brought all my negatives and got them digitized. And yeah, I'd literally never seen most of them because just squinted at them on a negative or a contact
Yeah.
sheet. And so
It's
it's
so
so great. I'm
cool.
trying to figure out, yeah, to maybe do a similar project with what I
Yes.
have. And then I'm also working on another photography book project over the next few months that it's going to be self-published. I think I'm going to do print on demand just to get it done on the timeline I want. But I love that you just went back to printing your own zine
Back to
and
my
sending
roots.
them out.
Yeah. And I should say that I've had a lot of practice documenting too, because over the years I've done a lot of work for an organization called Beyond the Streets, which is run by
Hmm.
Roger Gassman, who is from the DC area too. He's about maybe 9, 10 years younger than me, and I met him later. But he's an art curator who does all of these graffiti and street art exhibits, and
Okay.
he's published a lot of books through Beyond the Streets Publishing. And one of them was the 930 Club book that came out a few years ago. And I helped with
Oh, I haven't
that.
seen that. Okay.
And I've helped with a lot of his graffiti documentation, and I've written a lot of didactic text for his exhibits. So I've learned a lot about documenting and archiving over the years, just from doing all kinds of other work in the arts too.
That's cool. By chance, there was a book, I think I might even have it. I don't remember it, about Cool Disco Dan graffiti.
Yes.
Was he involved in that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Roger made the movie Cool Disco Dan, and
Yes.
there was an exhibit at the Corcoran in 2014, I think it was, called Pump Me Up.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
it was a combination of punk and go-go history from the area. And I helped with a lot of the text for that too.
That's great. I didn't realize you had your hand in that. So cool.
Yeah. And I got to display some of my flyers in frames on the wall
Oh, I love it.
just for keeping them all these years. That was pretty funny.
I know. Have mine in the basement, and from time to time, I'm like, I got to scan those all in. And
Ooh,
but
frame
I,
them,
I know.
your favorites.
When I moved away from DC in '95, it's interesting because I moved to New York at the end of '95, so we must have just sort of crossed each other. But
Yeah.
when you were coming back to DC, but I gave a bunch of my stuff to Mark Anderson because he collected stuff, and I think he's given a lot of his stuff to some real collections now. But I
Okay.
saved stuff that flyers from Atlanta, from the punk scene there when I was in high school, and then some of the DC stuff I didn't want to get rid of. And yeah,
Oh, cool.
I got to scan that stuff in sometime.
Yeah. I think it would be fun to do a show of punk ephemera from the South. Saying
Mm,
that you have stuff from Atlanta, and now I live in North Carolina, and I've thought a lot about that because I teach writing at the local art museum, and I'm like, I know there were little punk scenes all over the place, and it
yeah,
would be really cool to pull something like that together.
that would be great. And there's a guy who is at Emory University who started a collection there of stuff from the punk scene in Atlanta,
Mhm.
and similar to some of the stuff happening in DC, which is great. You know, and like when I was in high school, the band that was, in my eyes anyway, the biggest local band was called Neon Christ, and they were very political, and so that definitely helped steer me towards, political punk and towards the
Yeah.
DC scene because some of them were friends with people in DC bands, and
Oh, okay.
they knew
Cool.
Mark Anderson, so that's how I got linked with Mark Anderson and Positive Force.
Yeah.
But there were definitely punk scenes like back then. I remember Corrosion of Conformity was from North Carolina, and they were super
Yeah.
good friends with the folks in Atlanta, and there was a lot of
Mhm.
crossover, and all those
Yeah, there's a
scenes,
lot
yeah,
of
just aren't
history
as well
here
documented.
too. Yeah. And I've donated a bunch of stuff to the University of Maryland Punk Archive, which I think you have too, and to the archive at the MLK Library,
Hmm.
just because, you can't take it with you.
So I would love to hear some stories about some of the photos that are in your photo zine. Can you tell us about any of them?
Yeah. The Social Distortion one is pretty funny. So Pam and I loved Social D, and they're this California band that hadn't been to DC in years because Mike Ness had been in prison, and Pam and I were just waiting with bated breath for them to be on tour again. And then they came through in '88 to the 930 Club, and we, of course, made friends with them and interviewed them for our zine, and they were nice enough to do an interview with us. And um, we we invited them to play Safari Club next time that they were in town.
I love it.
But of course, they were just getting way too big by then, by that point. But in the middle of that show, I think Pam had the camera, and we were taking turns taking photos. One of us got up. There were signs everywhere that said no photos during this show, but we had interviewed the band beforehand and they said, sure, go ahead, take as many photos as you want. So we were getting up on the side of the stage, and you remember it's a very tiny stage, and we're getting up on the steps and on the side and taking pictures. And one of the 930 Club bouncers came and ripped the camera out of my hands, picked both of us up, and threw us outside of the
Wow.
show. Ripped the film out of the camera and threw it in a wastebasket in the hallway and said, "You guys are kicked out of the show. You saw the signs, no photos allowed." And so we were arguing, saying, the band said it was okay and blah, blah, blah. And they're saying, no, it's a rider in their contract that says absolutely no photos. And forget that, and you're kicked out of here. So we dug the film out of the trash, and we were really angry, and we met with the band afterward, and we were like, fuck this place. Play Safari Club next time you come to DC. We gave them our phone numbers, and to our surprise, there were a few usable photos once we got the film developed. Like, a lot of it had been exposed, but there were a few good
Yeah.
photos from that. And then the next time they came to town, they were coming to town. They were going down to Richmond after DC to play with Gwar.
Uh-huh.
And they invited us to ride with them on the tour bus down to Richmond. And we knew, and they were also playing with MFD, a DC area band. So we were like, we'll ride down with Social D and we'll ride back with MFD. And we go to Richmond, and they go to do sound check, and Pam and I are just like walking around the block. I think it was the Metro Club, and there's a brick building across the street that had a glass door and a very tiny Gore sticker on the door. And we were just joking, and we were like, wouldn't it be funny if Gore lived here? And we rang the doorbell, and this guy sticks his head out of the second story window. This guy with long hair is like, what do you want? And I think it was Dave Brocky. And and we're like, we have to come up with something. And we're like, hi, we're Pam and Shawna, and we do No Scene Zine out of DC, and we wanted to know if Gwar lives here. And he was like, hang on a second. And he throws his keys down. He's like, come on up. And
Wow.
they didn't live there, but it was a Gwar warehouse, and they had all of their costumes and guitars and paper mache stuff all laying around, and he was making a TV dinner, and he's like, what do you want to know? So we kind of did this fake impromptu interview with him all through
That's
the
amazing.
show, and got to see all the Gore stuff. And then we went back just as Social Distortion was playing their last chord, and we're like, thank you and good night. So we missed the whole show because we
Oh
were hanging
no.
out with Gore.
That's wild. Were they, I imagine they weren't all dressed up in their,
Oh
garb
no,
while
no,
they're
he
just
was just
hanging out at
like,
home.
no, he was just like a regular guy with long hair who was like working on the props there in the warehouse.
But
But we just were having a good time chatting with him and
I
missed the
think you
whole.
do have a photo of Guar in there too, though, right?
No, I don't have any Gore photos in here. I do have a Veil who started in
Well,
Reston and became a Richmond band. I
mm-hmm.
booked them at Safari Club when Tim was the drummer, and Avail had a different singer named Brian. Yeah, Pantera, Green Day. I shot them a couple different times at Lollapalooza and then later in Los Angeles. In L7 backstage at Lollapalooza. Fugazi at Fort Reno Park.
There's Henry Rollins, I think I saw in
Yeah,
there.
Henry
Hmm.
Rollins a couple times at the 930 Club. Yeah, Agnostic Front at the Whiskey.
Yeah, that's so great that you were documenting all of that because, uh, yeah, not a lot of people were. I guess just a couple more questions and then we can
Mhm.
wrap up. But you wrote a cool essay that I really liked that I saw recently. It was in 2017. Never call yourself a writer and other rules for writing. And
Yes,
it,
a satirical piece, which appeared in Brevity magazine. it was just kind of a making fun of all of the conflicting advice that you get when you set out to become a writer or when you start out in a writing program. You know, I'd gotten my MFA and people just tell you all kinds of things and none of it really matches up and there is no one linear way to become an artist. So I just kind of wanted to make a collage of all that different advice and put it all in one place so people could see how bizarre it is and to encourage people to find their own paths to being a writer.
Yeah, I love it. And
Thank
my
you.
I have one kid who is studying writing, and I shared it with her, and yeah,
Oh, cool.
it's really nice.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Is there anything else you'd want to touch on that we didn't talk about yet, or any new projects on the horizon you want to preview for my millions of listeners?
I have a Substack now.
Oh, cool.
I'm foraying into the world of Substack. So it's called Poser Yoga for Angry People because I'm in the middle of yoga teacher training. I've practiced yoga for 25 years, but I'm in the middle of becoming a yoga teacher and I'm documenting that whole process on Substack. My hence my proclivity to document, I guess.
Right?
But it's essays and short yoga videos and just different takes on the things that I'm learning. And I'm also ghostwriting a memoir for graffiti artist turned fine artist Lady Pink, who came out of the New York City subway graffiti scene. So I'm doing that right now for Beyond the Streets.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah, it's really fun.
So where can people find you and your work online? And can people get your books live at the Safari Club and your All Access Bands and Film Zine and other writing projects?
ShawnaKenney.com, ShawnaKenney.com. And you can contact me through the contact form on there too. And I'm on Instagram at Shawna J. Kenney because someone else had my name. So I had to put my name.
I got lucky. I got my name actually on Instagram.
Oh, awesome.
On some platforms now.
Yes.
Cool. Well, thanks so much for taking time to talk. And it's been really great to reconnect after so many years.
I know. It's so awesome. And thank you for documenting the documenters.
Yeah, very niche project, but important to me, it feels like.
Very cool.
And at least good for conversations because the people who document stuff are there and see a lot of things happening that a lot of people don't think to observe or remember.
Yeah. You get to be an audio zinester.
Yeah. Hey, I love it. You can support Red Lens Podcast by supporting my Patreon. Go to patreon.com/SiegelPhotos, SIGALPHOTOS, and sign up for a small monthly donation. That will go a long way in helping sustain the podcast and my work as a political photographer. Thank you for checking out and supporting Red Lens Podcast.